The road was quiet, too quiet, as Kelechi's car rattled over uneven dirt. The trees on either side stood like dark sentinels, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. A dense mist rolled in, swallowing the world in white. She tightened her grip on the wheel, her stomach knotting with unease. Then, as her headlights pierced the fog, a sign emerged, leaning crookedly by the roadside. The paint was faded, the words barely legible. "Welcome to Esabayeni." Below it, a scratched-out number once marked the population, now a haunting reminder of lives abandoned. She pulled over and stepped out, her boots crunching against the gravel. The air was heavy, almost metallic, with a chill that wrapped around her like a warning. The mist clung to her skin as she stared at the sign. "What happened here?" she muttered to herself, her voice almost swallowed by the silence. A faint whisper drifted through the air, soft and fleeting, like someone calling from a distance. Kelechi froze, her eyes scanning the empty road and the dense wall of trees. There was no one there. Shaking off her nerves, she climbed back into the car and drove into the township. The sight that greeted her was even more unsettling. Crumbling houses with shattered windows lined the streets, their walls streaked with dirt and age. A few figures shuffled in the distance, but as her car approached, they quickly disappeared into shadows, shutting doors behind them. She parked near what appeared to be the center of the township, a square dominated by an ancient-looking tree with roots that seemed to claw at the earth. As she stepped out, an old man pushing a wheelbarrow paused mid-step, his eyes locking on her. His face twisted in fear, and he muttered something under his breath before abandoning the wheelbarrow and darting inside a nearby building. Kelechi sighed. "Friendly place," she murmured. Grabbing her bag and camera from the car, she spotted a sign hanging above a rickety building, Mama Zola's Haven. The words were faded, but it was clear this was her destination. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of herbs and something metallic, almost like blood. The dim light barely illuminated the room, where jars lined the walls, their contents unrecognizable. Behind the counter stood an elderly woman, her back slightly hunched, her hands grinding something in a stone bowl. She didn't look up as Kelechi entered. "You shouldn't have come here," the woman said, her voice low but firm. Kelechi hesitated, caught off guard by the greeting. "I'm here to investigate," she began, but the woman cut her off with a sharp glance. "Investigate?" she repeated, her tone almost mocking. "This is not a place for questions, child." Kelechi stepped closer, her curiosity outweighing her caution. "People are dying. Strange things are happening here. I need to know why." For a moment, the woman studied her, her dark eyes piercing and unreadable. Finally, she sighed. "Some stories are better left untold," she said softly, turning back to her work. "But stay if you must. Just remember, do not wander after dark. And if you hear them whisper," she added, her voice dropping to a whisper of its own, "do not answer." That night, the silence of the township pressed in on Kelechi as she sat in her tiny guest house room. The walls seemed to creak with the weight of the air, and the lone bulb above her flickered intermittently. She tried to focus on her notes, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Mama Zola's warning. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters, and then, just as she began typing, she heard it. A faint whisper. "Kelechi?" Her fingers froze over the keyboard. She turned slowly toward the window, her heart pounding. The mist outside swirled lazily, but nothing moved. Then the whisper came again, clearer this time. "Help us." Kelechi stood, her pulse racing. She grabbed her camera and pressed record, speaking into it to calm herself. January 3rd, Esabayeni Township, Night 1. Something strange is happening here. Her voice wavered as the sound of a child's laughter echoed faintly from the hallway. She swallowed hard, moving toward the door. Slowly she opened it, peering into the dimly lit corridor. It was empty, the flickering light casting long, uneven shadows, but the laughter faded, leaving behind only the oppressive silence. She stood there for a moment, unsure whether to step out or retreat. Then, with a deep breath, she closed the door and locked it, pressing her back against it as her heart continued to pound. The night stretched on, and the whispers didn't stop. The morning light did little to soften the unease hanging over Esabayeni. Kelechi wandered through the township, her camera in hand, its lens capturing the desolation around her. Abandoned homes leaned against one another like weary old men, their walls cracked and blistered. Broken windows reflected the gray sky, and rusted metal gates screeched faintly in the wind. Her curiosity led her to a house on the edge of the square. The door was ajar, its hinges rusted. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with dust and memories. Kelechi stepped carefully, the wooden floor groaning beneath her feet. She froze when her eyes landed on a small doll lying in the corner. Its face was scorched, as if someone had held it too close to a fire. The eyes, though faded, seemed to stare accusingly. Above the doll, strange symbols were etched into the wall, their jagged lines telling a story she couldn't understand. "What happened here?" she whispered, more to herself than to anyone. Her voice echoed faintly in the empty room, swallowed by the silence. She took a few pictures, her hands trembling slightly. As she turned to leave, the faint sound of footsteps reached her ears. She spun around, her breath hitching, but there was no one there. Only the doll, staring. Kelechi decided to seek answers from the living. She found Duma, a gaunt man with hollow eyes, sitting on the steps of what might once have been a general store. His clothes were worn, his hands rough from years of toil. He glanced at her as she approached, but didn't speak. "You've been here a long time," she said cautiously, sitting a few steps below him. "Can you tell me what's going on?" He let out a bitter laugh, the sound sharp and hollow. "Going on?" he repeated, shaking his head. "You think this is just happening now? No, miss. This place has been dying for years." "What do you mean?" Kelechi pressed. Duma stared at the horizon, his voice low. "We sinned, all of us, a sin too great to escape." His hands trembled slightly as he clenched them into fists. "We killed them, burned them, and they cursed us for it." Kelechi frowned. "Who?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Duma's eyes darted toward the forest at the edge of the township. "The outsiders," he said. "They were strangers, didn't belong here. We thought they brought the drought, the sickness. We thought we were saving ourselves." His voice broke and he turned away. "But we were wrong." Later that day, Kelechi dug through the archives stored in a dusty office next to the township hall. She sifted through old photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes, piecing together a story that chilled her. Years ago, a group of strangers had arrived in Esibayeni. They were healers, or so they claimed, but their practices seemed foreign, strange. Fear spread like wildfire, and when the crops failed and the children grew ill, fingers pointed to the outsiders. In her mind's eye, the events unfolded like a black and white film. A mob gathered, torches casting flickering shadows on terrified faces. The outsiders were dragged from their homes, their cries of innocence drowned by the roar of anger. The scene ended in flames, their voices rising in a final haunting chorus as the fire consumed them. "You will pay," they had screamed. "This land will remember, and so will we." Kelechi shuddered, the echo of their curse lingering in her ears. She leaned back in the chair, the weight of the township's history pressing down on her chest. She glanced out the window, her eyes catching movement near the edge of the forest. A figure stood there, shrouded in shadow, watching her. Grabbing her camera, she rushed outside, her shoes crunching against the gravel as she approached the spot where the figure had been. But when she reached the edge of the forest, there was no one there. The air was colder here, the trees looming overhead like silent witnesses. She felt a chill crawl up her spine, as if unseen eyes were still on her. That evening she confronted Mama Zola, determined to get answers. "I know what happened," she said, her voice firm. "I know about the curse." Mama Zola looked at her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke, her voice heavy with sorrow. "The forest does not forget, child," she said, "and neither will they." Her words lingered, a warning as sharp as the wind that howled outside. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Kelechi couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The township seemed to exhale, its shadows growing longer, its silence heavier. She stared at the edge of the forest from her window, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had uncovered. Somewhere in the darkness, she thought she saw movement again. But this time, she didn't go looking. The township seemed different now, as if it were waking from a restless sleep. Kelechi noticed it in the subtle shifts, the way doors creaked open on their own, the way the wind carried faint whispers that felt too deliberate to ignore. The air was colder, heavier, pressing against her chest as she moved through the narrow streets. It wasn't just the desolation, it was something else, something alive. At the guest house, the first signs of the entity's growing power became unmistakable. Kalechi sat at the small wooden table, reviewing her notes, when the temperature in the room dropped abruptly. Her breath misted in the air, and the lamp on her desk flickered. Then, without warning, her pen rolled across the table, stopping at the edge before falling to the floor. She froze, her pulse quickening, but when she reached for the pen, it slid away, as if pulled by invisible fingers. Outside, the voices began. Disembodied and faint at first, they whispered her name, Kalechi. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. She pressed her hands over her ears, trying to block it out, but the voices grew louder, overlapping, insistent. Then they stopped, leaving behind a suffocating silence. Duma was not spared from the entity's wrath. In his tiny home, he sat clutching a bottle, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch and twist, forming shapes that shouldn't have been there. He blinked hard, his breath coming in short gasps as he saw them, the faces of the victims. They stared at him, their eyes hollow, their mouths twisted in silent screams. One reached out, her charred hand brushing his arm. He screamed, falling back, the bottle shattering on the floor. "Leave me alone," he yelled, his voice cracking. But the visions didn't fade. Instead, they closed in, their accusing eyes boring into him. "We trusted you," one of them whispered. "You betrayed us," said another. He clawed at his face, trying to block them out, but they were everywhere. That evening, Kalechi confronted Mama Zola again. The elderly woman sat by the fire, her face lit by the flickering flames. For a long moment, she didn't speak, her eyes fixed on the flames as if they held the answers she sought. Finally, she sighed, her voice heavy with resignation. "They are not just spirits," she began, her tone low but firm. "They are anger, they are pain, and they will not rest until their story is told." She looked at Kalechi, her expression a mix of sorrow and warning. "The curse binds them here. They feed on guilt, punishing those who refuse to atone. The longer you stay, the more you will feel it. Their pain will become yours." Kalechi sat back, her mind racing. "But why now?" she asked. "Why are they getting stronger?" Mama Zola's gaze darkened. "Because their anger grows. With each passing year, the truth is buried deeper and their cries go unheard. They will not stop until someone listens." It wasn't long before the investigation turned personal. Late one night, as she sifted through old Township records, Kalechi stumbled upon a name that made her blood run cold. Her father's. A journal entry from decades ago detailed the names of the mob who had taken part in the lynching, and there it was, James Obiora. Her father, who had always been distant, who had always avoided speaking of his childhood, had been part of the mob that had condemned the outsiders to their fiery end. Kalechi stared at the page, her hands trembling. Memories of her father's silence about Esibayeni came rushing back. He had fled the township, abandoning it and the curse, leaving others to bear the burden of his sins. She felt a wave of anger and shame wash over her. How could he have done this? And why had he never told her the truth? She slammed the journal shut, tears stinging her eyes. Her investigation was no longer just about uncovering the township's secrets. It was about confronting her own family's dark past. The weight of it pressed down on her, a heavy reminder that she could no longer run from the truth. As the night deepened, the whispers returned, louder and more persistent. They no longer called her name, they cried for justice, and this time, Kalechi couldn't ignore them. The night was darker than usual, the township square shrouded in a heavy mist that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The remaining residents gathered reluctantly, their faces pale and drawn. Mama Zola stood at the center, her hands clutching a bundle of dried herbs tied with crimson thread. A large clay bowl sat before her, filled with ash, water, and something faintly glowing, a mixture she refused to explain. "This will not be easy," she began, her voice carrying over the uneasy crowd. "The spirits demand acknowledgement, they demand truth." Her gaze swept over the group, landing briefly on Kalechi, who stood at the edge of the gathering, her camera in hand. "If we do not face them tonight, there may not be a tomorrow." The residents shifted uneasily, murmuring among themselves. Duma stood apart, his face a mask of defiance, though his trembling hands betrayed his fear. "This is pointless," he muttered. "We can't undo the past." Mama Zola ignored him and began the ritual. She lit the herbs, the smoke rising in a spiral that seemed unnaturally dense. She muttered incantations in a language no one else understood, her voice steady despite the growing tension in the air. The wind picked up, swirling around the square, tugging at clothes and scattering dust. The mist thickened, coiling like snakes around their feet. Then the first scream tore through the night. The clay bowl shattered without warning, its contents spilling onto the ground and hissing as if burned. The wind howled, and the mist seemed to come alive, twisting into shapes, figures with hollow eyes and charred skin. They moved toward the crowd, their whispers turning to shrieks. Duma's voice rose above the chaos. "No, stay back," he yelled, stumbling as one of the figures reached for him. Its hand, blackened and skeletal, gripped his arm, and he screamed. A sound of pure terror that echoed through the square. The mist enveloped him, dragging him backward into the shadows. His screams faded, leaving only silence. The residents scattered, panic overtaking them. Kelechi stood frozen, her camera trembling in her hands as she tried to capture the scene. The lens focused on the swirling mist, but when she played back the footage, only static filled the screen. Her recorder, meant to document the event, emitted low, guttural whispers instead of the cries and chaos she had heard. She dropped it, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in her ears. When the mist began to recede, the remaining residents huddled together, their fear turning to anger. "This is your fault," one man spat, pointing at another. "You're the one who called for the mob." "And you didn't stop me, did you?" the other shot back, his face flushed with guilt. The group descended into argument, their voices rising, accusations flying. "You all played a part in this," Mama Zola interrupted, her voice cutting through the noise. "But denial will not save you. The spirits see everything." Kelechi, desperate to make sense of what was happening, stepped forward. "Enough," she shouted. "We need answers, not blame." Her voice wavered as she added, "I need to know what's happening here." As if in response, the wind picked up again, carrying with it a voice. Low, guttural, and filled with rage. "James Obiore," growled. Kelechi froze. The voice echoed her father's name, each syllable sharper than the last. Her camera fell from her hands as the mist began to form again, this time coalescing into a shape. It grew taller, darker, until a figure emerged, a grotesque amalgamation of the lynched victims. Its body was charred and broken, its face a horrifying patchwork of twisted features. Eyes that seemed to glow with a malevolent light locked onto Kelechi, and its mouth twisted into a mocking grin. "Your father," it hissed, its voice like the scraping of metal. "He ran, he hid, but the blood is on his hands." Kelechi felt the weight of the entity's gaze, her chest tightening as if it were pressing the air from her lungs. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The entity leaned closer, its breath cold and foul. "The truth," it said, before dissolving into the mist, leaving Kelechi gasping and alone. The square was silent now, the residents staring at her, their faces pale with terror. Mama Zola stepped forward, placing a hand on Kelechi's shoulder. "You must finish this," she said quietly, "or the curse will never end." The township square was quiet now, a fragile stillness that felt more ominous than comforting. Kelechi sat on the steps of the guest house, her mind racing. The whispers of the entity echoed in her ears, its accusation against her father cutting deeper than she wanted to admit. She glanced at the remaining residents, huddled together in small groups, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion. They avoided her gaze just as they avoided the truth that hung between them. Kelechi stood abruptly, her voice firm as she addressed the group. "This curse," she began, her words cutting through the silence, "it's not going to stop. It feeds on your silence, your denial. The longer you hide from what you did, the stronger it becomes." Her words stirred unease among the crowd, but no one responded. Mama Zola stepped forward, her presence commanding. "She's right," the old woman said, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was about to propose. "You cannot bury the past, you must face it. Confess your sins and ask for forgiveness." One of the men, his face pale and drawn, shook his head violently. "You don't understand," he said. "If we speak it, if we admit it, the spirits will destroy us." "They're already destroying you," Kelechi snapped, her frustration boiling over. "If you won't confess to each other, then confess to them. Let them hear the truth." Mama Zola nodded solemnly. "We must go to the forest," she said, her voice heavy with resignation. to the place where it all began. The group stood at the edge of the forest, their breaths visible in the cold night air. The trees loomed like ancient judges, their twisted branches casting eerie shadows under the moonlight. Kelechi felt her heart pounding in her chest as she held her camera tightly, unsure if it was for documentation or protection. "This is the place," Mama Zola said, her voice a mix of reverence and dread. "The place where they were taken, where their lives were stolen." The residents hesitated, but Kelechi's glare urged them forward. Slowly, one by one, they began to speak. "I was there," an elderly woman admitted, her voice trembling. "I didn't stop them. I didn't even try. I lit the first torch," another man confessed, his eyes brimming with tears. I thought it would save us." As each confession spilled out, the air seemed to grow lighter, less oppressive. The mist that clung to the forest floor began to recede, and for a moment, hope flickered in Kelechi's chest. But then, one man stepped back, his face twisting in defiance. "No," he spat. "I won't do it. I had no choice then, and I have no guilt now. They were the ones who cursed us, not the other way around." The wind picked up violently, whipping through the trees and tearing at their clothes. The mist returned with a vengeance, swirling around the group like a predator circling its prey. The entity emerged from the shadows, taller and more grotesque than before, its voice a guttural roar that shook the earth. "Liar," it bellowed, its glowing eyes fixed on the defiant man. The ground beneath him cracked open, and he screamed as skeletal hands reached up, dragging him into the abyss. His cries faded, replaced by the entity's malevolent laughter. The remaining residents panicked, but Mama Zola stepped forward, her face calm, resolute. She held up her hands, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Enough!" she cried. "Take me. Let my life be the price to end this." "No!" Kelechi shouted, rushing toward her. "There has to be another way." Mama Zola turned to her, her eyes filled with a sorrowful wisdom. "There is no other way, child. Some debts can only be paid in blood." She reached out, placing a hand on Kelechi's cheek. "You must tell our story. You must make sure this never happens again." Before Kelechi could respond, Mama Zola began to chant, her voice strong and rhythmic, a language older than time. The entity roared, its form shifting and writhing as it moved toward her. The mist enveloped her, and for a moment, Kelechi thought she saw the faces of the victims in the swirling fog. They were no longer twisted with anger, but peaceful, almost grateful. With a final burst of light, the entity and Mama Zola vanished, leaving behind a deafening silence. The air was still, the forest unnervingly quiet. The remaining residents stood frozen, their faces pale and tear-streaked. Kelechi fell to her knees, her camera slipping from her grasp. The curse wasn't gone, not entirely. But for now, the township could breathe again. The forest was silent, unnervingly so. The storm that had raged moments before was gone, leaving behind an eerie calm. The mist dissipated slowly, revealing the scarred ground where Mama Zola had made her final stand. The remaining residents stood in stunned silence, their faces a mix of grief and relief. The oppressive weight in the air seemed lighter now, though not entirely gone. Kelechi sat on the ground, clutching her camera to her chest. Her breathing was ragged, her mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. Mama Zola's final words echoed in her ears. "You must tell our story." Slowly she stood, brushing dirt from her jeans, and began to adjust the camera. She scanned the crowd, capturing the hollow-eyed residents as they whispered prayers, their voices trembling with emotion. She turned to the others, her voice steady despite the chaos within her. "This isn't over," she said. "The curse might be weakened, but it's not gone. If you want to keep it at bay, you have to honor her sacrifice. You have to tell the truth." An older woman nodded, tears streaking her weathered face. "We will," she whispered. "We'll keep the rituals. We'll never forget what we did." For the first time since her arrival, Kelechi felt a flicker of hope. The residents were broken, but perhaps they could rebuild. Not just their homes, but their humanity. The township looked different in the light of dawn. The shadows that had once clung to every corner were less menacing, though the scars of the night remained. Kelechi packed her things, her hands moving mechanically as her mind replayed the events over and over. She loaded her car, her journal and camera occupying the passenger seat. Before leaving, she walked to the edge of the square, where the residents had gathered to clear the remnants of the ritual. They paused as she approached, their gazes heavy with gratitude and sorrow. "I'll make sure the world knows," Kelechi promised, her voice steady. No more silence. The group nodded in unison, and one by one they turned back to their work. Kelechi climbed into her car, starting the engine as the township faded into the rearview mirror. The road out of Esibayeni was just as desolate as when Kelechi had arrived. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the dirt path. She exhaled deeply, her fingers tapping nervously on the steering wheel. Despite the calm, a nagging feeling tugged at the back of her mind, a sense that she wasn't entirely alone. Then, faint but unmistakable, she heard it. Laughter. The sound of a child, soft and lilting, carried on the wind. Her heart clenched as she glanced in the rearview mirror. At first, there was nothing but empty road, stretching endlessly behind her. But as she kept driving, something appeared. A figure standing at the edge of the forest, just where the trees began to thicken. Kelechi's breath caught in her throat. The figure was small and shadowy, its features obscured by the mist that clung to the forest's edge. She couldn't see its face, but she felt its eyes on her, piercing and unrelenting. The laughter grew louder, echoing in her ears even as the figure faded into the distance. Her hands gripped the wheel tighter, her pulse quickening. The car picked up speed, dust kicking up behind her, but the laughter didn't stop. It followed her, persistent and mocking, even as she sped away from the township. As the road stretched ahead, the whispers returned, louder this time. They seemed to seep into the car, curling around her like smoke, impossible to block out. Kelechi clenched her jaw, refusing to look back again, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The screen fades to black and the whispers grow deafening.